She met him on an ordinary Tuesday in a moment so small it barely registered. The something in his eyes made her stop. They didn't sparkle with confidence or joy. They looked worn, like a man who had once loved deeply and lost something he hadn't even finished building. There was a sadness to the way he smiled, a certain stiffness in his compliments, as if he were remembering how to be kind rather than genuinely feeling it. She didn't mind. In fact, she found it intriguing. Pain in a man looked like depth to her back then. It looked like potential. He didn't talk about his ex right away. At first it was subtle, tucked into the edges of stories, how he avoided a certain restaurant now, how he didn't like sunflowers because they reminded him of something he didn't care to explain. She noticed these small omissions but told herself it was healthy. He was healing. He was trying. And maybe, just maybe, she could be the one to help him forget. He had this way of watching her that made her feel like she was something fragile, a glass sculpture placed too close to the edge of a shelf. It thrilled her, that sense of being precious. She worked hard to be gentle around him, to smile the way she imagined he needed. In the beginning, he returned her efforts with soft hands and half-formed confessions. There were days he'd hold her tighter than made sense for such a new relationship, nights when he clung to her like he was afraid she'd vanish in her sleep. She mistook it for passion. For connection. She didn't see it for what it was, grief looking for a familiar shape. The first time he bought her something, it was a dress. Pale green, not a color she usually wore. It was delicate, old-fashioned, with thin straps and a cinched waist. She tried it on and stared at herself in the mirror, unsure if she recognized the woman staring back. He told her she looked beautiful and she believed him because she wanted to. He took her out that night to a quiet little bistro tucked behind a bookstore. The lighting was dim, the wine red, and she felt like she was stepping into someone else's life. She didn't know then that she was. As the weeks passed, she found herself adjusting in small ways. She'd twist her hair into a loose bun because he once said it looked elegant. She stopped wearing dark lipstick because he said natural suited her better. He wasn't forceful, never demanding, never cruel. He made her want to change. That was the most dangerous kind of influence. He offered compliments with a melancholy edge, as if he was always comparing her to a memory. She started to wonder who he had loved before but never asked directly. She was afraid of the answer, afraid of becoming just another page in a long, unfinished story. Their intimacy grew, but something always felt slightly off. As if he was holding back some part of himself, some essential truth that he didn't think she could handle. She tried to reach him in small, loving ways. Notes slipped into his jacket pocket. Breakfast in bed, quiet nights spent listening to old records. He appreciated her, she could tell. But appreciation isn't the same as love. And somewhere deep inside, she began to feel it. That gnawing suspicion that she was being measured against a ghost. It wasn't until they had been together for nearly 2 months that he mentioned her by name. The ex. It happened in passing, a quick reference to something she used to cook. She smiled, tight-lipped, and nodded, pretending it didn't bother her. But it did. That night, lying beside him, she stared at the ceiling and wondered what meals she could make that were entirely her own. What parts of herself hadn't been touched by another woman's fingerprints. She didn't want to compete with a memory. She wanted to be seen for herself, not through the filter of what came before. Still, she held on. He was kind in his quiet way. He made her tea when she was tired, ran his fingers through her hair when she couldn't sleep. And when he looked at her, sometimes, just sometimes, it felt like he really saw her. Like he wanted her. Not as a replacement, but as a woman standing wholly in her own skin. She clung to those moments like lifelines, refusing to believe they were exceptions rather than the rule. One afternoon, while helping him clean his apartment, she found a box in the back of the closet. Inside were photos, letters, little tokens from a life she hadn't lived. She didn't read them. She didn't need to. The way they were organized, preserved, almost sacred, told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't over her. Not really. And maybe he never would be. But she didn't leave. She told herself she wasn't threatened. That everyone had a past. That love meant accepting the whole person, even the chapters you weren't a part of. Over time, she started to notice patterns. The perfume he complimented on her wasn't her usual scent. The way he touched her hair, the pet names he used, none of it felt original. It was like slipping into someone else's rhythm, learning the steps to a dance she hadn't chosen. But instead of pulling back, she leaned in. Determined to be the one who finally stayed. The one who didn't break him. The one who could handle his damage. She didn't realize she was already erasing herself. By the time summer turned to fall, she had memorized his favorite stories, laughed at the jokes she didn't find funny, and wore the clothes he picked out without complaint. Friends started to say she looked different. Softer, quieter, less like herself. She brushed it off with a smile. Said love changes people. Said it was normal. Said she was just growing. But deep down, something in her had begun to shrink. A small voice that used to speak up was now silent. Her reflection felt unfamiliar. Her laughter sounded rehearsed. And still, he would sometimes fall silent at the sight of something, a song on the radio, a certain color of light, and she'd know he was remembering her. Not the current her. The other her. The original. And she, the woman he had chosen, was slowly becoming a copy. It started with the smallest comparisons, the kind that sounded more like compliments than red flags. He would mention how she held her wine glass differently, how her handwriting curved in a way he found unique. But each time he spoke, there was an echo of someone else, as though he were seeing her through a lens clouded by memory. She noticed it, of course, but brushed it away, convincing herself it was harmless. People talked about their pasts all the time. Besides, he wasn't saying anything cruel. If anything, it felt like he was admiring her more for these similarities. So she took them in like sugar-coated pills, barely noticing how they began to accumulate. Eventually, it wasn't just gestures or habits. It became moods, tones, even timing. He would smile when she laughed a certain way, more than usual. She began to mimic that rhythm unconsciously. He once told her, almost absently, that his ex used to hum while she cooked, and the next time she stood in front of the stove, she found herself doing it too, surprised by the sound of her own voice. It wasn't something she'd ever done before, but his smile when he heard it made her stomach twist. There was warmth there, unmistakable. And the warmth was addictive. The playlist came one quiet afternoon while they were driving. She expected casual music, something upbeat or neutral, but instead, he played a list so curated it felt like a diary entry. Every song had a melancholic thread running through it, like they belonged to some unfinished love story. She didn't recognize most of them, but he did. He knew every word. He tapped his fingers along the steering wheel and closed his eyes at the chorus of one track, breathing in like it hurt to remember and felt good at the same time. When he opened his eyes and looked at her, there was a softness that made her feel lucky. But underneath it, there was something colder. Something removed. Like he wasn't seeing her at all. When they got home, she asked him about the music in a voice laced with curiosity but anchored in dread. He shrugged, said it reminded him of a time when things felt pure. Not better, just simpler. She nodded and smiled like she understood, like it didn't sting. But that night, she stayed up replaying the songs in her head, trying to imagine the scenes they must have scored, trying to picture what his life had looked like when he first fell in love. Not with her. With her. She began to feel like she was chasing a ghost, not out of jealousy but desperation. If she could understand the woman who came before, maybe she could become someone worth remembering differently. Someone worth loving fully. But the more she tried to map the past, the more blurred her present became. She couldn't tell where she ended and this other woman began. She didn't even know her name until she accidentally saw it on a saved number in his phone. He didn't hide it, and that somehow made it worse. The familiarity of it. Like she was never erased, only tucked away for later. Over dinner one night, he complimented her on how she held her fork. The way she moved her hand. It was oddly specific. Too specific. It didn't feel like admiration anymore. It felt like measurement. Like she was being evaluated against something he had lost and hadn't let go of. She wondered what else he saw. What other fragments of his former lover still lived in his mind, stitched into the fabric of their routine. She wondered if she was even real to him, or just a soft echo in a new body. He never said she reminded him of the ex directly. Not then. It was always dressed in safer words. Like déjà vu. Or you're just like this person I once knew. But she knew. She felt it in his touch when he traced the curve of her back absent-mindedly. And the way he'd stop mid-sentence sometimes and stare, like her presence had taken him somewhere else. It didn't feel romantic. It felt like watching someone relive a memory while pretending to build something new. A performance he hadn't even realized he was staging. One evening, he brought home a small bottle of perfume. He said he liked the scent, that it suited her. She had never worn anything like it. When she sprayed it on her wrist, something in her recoiled. It smelled too floral, too light. Not her. But when he leaned in and smiled, she said nothing. That night, he pulled her closer than usual. He buried his face in her neck and whispered things she didn't quite understand. She didn't ask him to repeat them. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. She started to keep a journal around that time. Just small notes, half thoughts. She wrote down how often he mentioned certain foods, certain places, names of songs he hummed without realizing. She wasn't sure why. Maybe she was trying to understand the shape of the woman he had loved before. Or maybe she was trying to trace the outline of her own vanishing identity. Either way, the pages began to fill quickly, and the pattern became undeniable. He wasn't falling in love with her. He was chasing a version of love he had already lived once. And she, whether she wanted to admit it or not, had become the substitute. Every time she caught herself adjusting her behavior to match what she thought he wanted, she felt a strange mixture of power and shame. Power because she could mold herself into something desirable. Shame because she knew it wasn't real. She wasn't being chosen. She was being tolerated, celebrated only when she aligned with the memories she didn't share. The parts of her that didn't match? They were simply ignored. Still, she didn't stop. She leaned into the comparisons, sometimes even baiting them. Asking what the ex was like, what she wore, what she said. He always hesitated, but she could see the flicker of nostalgia in his eyes. And she hated how much it thrilled her when he answered. She hated how hungry she was for crumbs of someone else's story. As if understanding the template made her more valuable. As if becoming her made her more lovable. In the quiet moments when he was asleep beside her, she would stare at the ceiling and wonder how much of herself she had already lost. She couldn't remember the last time she bought something just because she liked it. Or laugh without thinking how it sounded. Her world had become shaped by his memories, his needs, his quiet, unreachable grief. And she, the woman who once walked into his life believing she could heal him, was now the one bleeding silently in the dark. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. The shift was gradual, quiet, and deliberate, like a slow remodeling of the self. It began with suggestions, small ones, offered with a smile that made refusal feel like cruelty. He asked her to wear her hair a certain way, said it framed her face better. He preferred it straight, long, with a center part. She used to like the soft waves she wore naturally, but one morning she found herself standing in front of the mirror with a flat iron, smoothing out the texture of her identity one strand at a time. When he saw her, he smiled that familiar, satisfied smile and kissed her forehead. That smile became a goal in itself, an addictive reward that made the changes feel like progress. Then came the perfume. He handed her the bottle with a casual sort of intimacy, telling her he'd noticed it in a store window and thought of her. It was light, floral, and nothing like the warm, spicy scents she usually chose. But when she wore it, he leaned in more closely, lingered longer, and seemed softer somehow. Like the scent unlocked something nostalgic inside him. She didn't ask what it reminded him of. She already knew. The answer hovered, unspoken, between them like mist, always present, never acknowledged. Her clothes started to change next. Subtly then obviously. He would compliment her more when she wore delicate colors, blush pinks, soft creams, dusty blues. The bolder outfits she once wore with pride began to feel out of place in their shared life. She started leaving them at the back of her closet, replacing them with dresses that flowed and folded the way she imagined his ex must have worn. Once she saw a photo tucked inside an old journal he left on the coffee table. Just a glimpse, just a second, but it was enough. The woman in the picture was smiling, her hair perfectly straight, wearing the same shade of pink he had once insisted looked so perfect on her. She said nothing. Just folded the page back in place and walked to the bathroom, where she sat on the closed toilet lid and stared at the tiles until the numbness settled over her again. What disturbed her the most wasn't his desire to mold her. It was how willing she had become to let him. She had started to participate in her own erasure, finding satisfaction in the way he looked at her when she got it right. Because when she resembled the memory he hadn't let go of, he touched her with more intensity. He held her longer. He whispered things in the dark that made her feel like she mattered. Even if she wasn't sure who exactly he was whispering to. Then came the intimacy. It changed in ways that made her skin crawl when she thought too long about it. He began to make requests, not harsh, not aggressive, but specific. Things she hadn't done before. Words she wouldn't normally say. At first, she thought he was just exploring, trying to connect on a deeper level. But soon, the pattern emerged. These weren't expressions of exploration. They were reenactments. One night, he asked her to say a particular phrase, something odd and intimate, And when she hesitated, he looked hurt, like she'd broken a moment he had waited for. She gave in, repeating the words without understanding their meaning, and saw how his expression changed, how his breath caught. That was the first time she felt like a stranger in her own body. Like a stage actress reciting lines she hadn't written in a play she hadn't agreed to perform. She began to catch glimpses of herself in the mirror and flinch. Not because she looked bad, but because she didn't recognize the woman staring back. The posture was more elegant, the clothes more muted, the scent unfamiliar. Her laugh had changed. Softer. More filtered. Less hers. And when she lay beside him at night, she listened to the way his breathing slowed when she curled into him exactly the way he liked. She used to sleep on her back. Now she pressed into his side like a puzzle piece cut to fit someone else. He started calling her by a nickname she had never heard before. It slipped out casually one evening, and when she looked at him, startled, he just smiled like it had always belonged to her. She said nothing, let it settle into the rhythm of their life. It was easier that way. Confrontation felt futile. She was already halfway into the transformation, and part of her wondered if stopping now would only mean losing what little closeness they had built. So she leaned in a little further, shaping herself like clay in his hands until there was nothing left to resist. She began to anticipate his desires before he voiced them. Memorized his routines, adjusted her responses, softened her tone, and curated her reactions. Every word, every movement became a performance. Not for applause but for presence. She didn't want love anymore. She just didn't want to be invisible. There was something terrifying in the way he would drift off mid-conversation, like she was fading even while sitting next to him. So she gave more. She became more. Of her there was less. When she was alone, she stopped journaling. The pages had started to feel accusatory, evidence of complicity in her own unraveling. Instead, she stared at the ceiling, fingers curled and fists against her stomach, trying to remember what she had looked like when she was still whole. She tried to recall the version of herself that would have walked away at the first sign of being used as a placeholder. But that woman felt distant now. Muted. Replaced. Sometimes when he held her close, she imagined he was thinking of someone else. And sometimes she welcomed the thought. Because it was easier to believe he was loving a ghost than to admit he didn't love her at all. Easier to pretend that she mattered more as a memory than as herself. She had become fluent in pretending, fluent in the language of substitution and self-denial. She could no longer tell the difference between sacrifice and surrender. The worst part was that he never demanded any of it. He never once said, "Be her." He simply responded better when she was. And that, more than anything, broke her. Because love should never be a test of resemblance. And yet, every day, she woke up wondering how close she was to perfecting the illusion. Wondering if this would be the day he finally stopped missing the woman who came before. Wondering if that day would come before she forgot completely how it felt to be herself. She didn't remember the exact moment when she crossed the line from adapting to surrendering. It wasn't marked by any dramatic event, no screaming argument or slammed door. It was quiet like most real endings are. It was the moment she began to tell herself that love, real love, meant becoming what someone else needed, even if that meant abandoning what she once was. She thought she was being mature. She thought she was being strong. In truth, she was giving up pieces of herself, one compromise at a time, until all that remained was a fragile outline of a woman trying desperately to be enough for someone who never looked at her without seeing someone else. She had become an expert at mimicry. Her days were patterned around his moods. She could tell by the way he put down his keys whether he wanted silence or affection. She could read his expressions like weather forecasts, adjusting her behavior with a precision that bordered on obsessive. If he wanted space, she became small. If he wanted warmth, she smiled until her cheeks hurt. There were moments she felt like a doll, programmed to respond to cues that had nothing to do with who she was and everything to do with who he missed. She thought the worst of it would be temporary. That eventually, once he healed enough, once she proved herself loyal and loving and patient, he would stop comparing. He would stop needing the ghost. But the more she gave, the more he seemed to slip into his own history. It wasn't just the perfume or the clothes anymore. It was the way he touched her, carefully, deliberately, like tracing old lines on a familiar page. It was the way he whispered words during intimacy that she didn't recognize, names she never asked about. And when she hesitated, when her body tensed in quiet protest, he noticed. He always noticed. And his silence afterward was heavier than any argument could have been. It was the silence of disappointment, not in her but in the illusion breaking. The pressure to perform became unbearable. She began to avoid mirrors, afraid of the woman staring back. Her eyes looked hollow, her posture always slightly tense, shoulders curled inward as if bracing for impact. Her voice had changed too. Softer, less certain. Even her laugh sounded rehearsed, as though it had been borrowed from someone else's memory. Her phone rang less. Friends stopped inviting her out. She had no stories to share, no joy to contribute. She was always tired but never rested. And he never asked why. Then came the breaking point, not in a dramatic eruption, but in the slow, painful realization that he didn't love her. Not truly. He loved what she represented. A second chance. A familiar comfort. A way to rewrite the past with a different ending. But he had never loved her for her. The evidence was everywhere now, impossible to ignore. The way he flinched when she said something spontaneous, something that didn't fit the mold. The way he pulled away when she cried, as if her pain didn't match the script he was trying to follow. One evening she stood at the kitchen counter chopping vegetables when he walked in behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. She froze. Not because she didn't want the touch, but because it felt too practiced, too timed. Like a scene he'd rehearsed. When she closed her eyes, she could almost see the other woman standing there in her place, wearing the same perfume, saying the same words he wanted to hear. And for a moment she didn't know which one of them she was. Her hands trembled. The knife clattered against the cutting board. He didn't notice. That night, she watched him sleep. He looked peaceful, content in a way she rarely felt anymore. She wanted to reach out and touch him, to feel something real, something unscripted. But her hands stayed by her sides. Her chest ached with a grief she couldn't explain, as if she were mourning someone still alive. Maybe she was mourning herself. The version of her that used to believe in honesty and mutual affection and the possibility of being loved just as she was. She began to fantasize about leaving. Not with anger, not with vengeance, but with quiet resolve. She imagined packing a single bag, walking out while he was still asleep, leaving a note with no explanations. Just a line or two about needing to remember who she was. But each time she tried to picture it, something stopped her. Not fear. Not hope. Something more pitiful, doubt. Doubt that she could survive without the shape of his approval, even if it was built on someone else's memory. Doubt that she was still enough on her own after all she had erased. Her world had shrunk. The walls of their apartment felt closer each day. She filled the spaces with silence, moving around like a guest in someone else's life. She started sleeping less, eating less. Her body responded to the emotional starvation by conserving energy, making her smaller, weaker. And still he said nothing. Still he kissed her forehead each morning and told her she smelled amazing. Still he held her hand in public and told strangers she was everything he'd ever wanted. But in private he was distant. Distracted. Lost in thought. She stopped asking what he was thinking about. She didn't want to hear the truth anymore. The truth was she was performing a role she never auditioned for. A role written by someone else for someone else. And the more she played it, the more she lost the ability to step out of character. She had become the X, the echo, the imitation. And he, whether knowingly or not, had become her director, shaping her gestures, controlling the lighting, deciding which parts of her were worth keeping and which were to be cut. She wasn't living. She was reenacting. What hurt most was the realization that she had let it happen. That at every stage she had chosen silence over truth, accommodation over confrontation. Not because she was weak, but because she was afraid of being alone. Afraid that without him, there would be nothing left to hold on to. But as the days passed and the silence grew louder, she began to suspect that being alone might hurt less than being invisible in a relationship that only loved the resemblance. She wasn't sure yet if she had the strength to leave. But for the first time in months, she was starting to feel the flicker of something dangerous. Something honest. A desire not to disappear completely. It began with a name. A simple name, casually written at the top of a text message she was never meant to see. He had left his phone on the kitchen counter, face up, screen glowing. She hadn't been snooping. She was reaching for a glass of water when the preview appeared, a single sentence from a conversation with someone she didn't know, but instantly recognized. Not the name itself, but the weight of it. It was hers. The ex. The woman she had been unwittingly impersonating for months. The woman whose shadow had always lingered just behind the curve of his smile, the quiet moments of distraction, the pauses before affection. Her name looked too comfortable on his screen. Too familiar. It wasn't a mistake. He was still speaking to her. Still feeding that connection. Still nurturing something she had been trying so hard to replace. She didn't read the full message. She couldn't. The heat in her stomach rose too fast, too sharp. She felt dizzy, as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. She walked to the bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the floor, her back against the tub, knees pulled to her chest. The tiles were cold. The silence in the apartment felt mocking. She breathed slowly, carefully, as if too much air would break her open. She had suspected for a long time that she was never the main character in his story. But now it felt worse. She wasn't just a placeholder. She was the imitation. The stand-in. And the real thing still had a direct line into his life. When she emerged from the bathroom an hour later, he was in the living room, watching something on his laptop, laughing softly at the screen. He didn't look guilty. He didn't look like a man caught in betrayal. He looked content. And that, more than anything, shattered something inside her. Because he wasn't hiding it. He wasn't protecting her from the truth. He simply didn't see a reason to. She wasn't the person he felt accountable to. She was the approximation. The safer version of the real thing. The one who wouldn't leave this time. The one who stayed quiet. The one who tried so hard not to be a burden. She didn't confront him. Not then. What would she say? That she saw a name she already knew was still alive in their relationship? That she had been reshaping herself into someone he could have simply gone back to instead? The questions had no clean answers. Only pain. Only the sharp sting of recognition. In the days that followed, she became quieter. More observant. She watched the way he scrolled through his phone with a faint smile. She listened more carefully to the names he mentioned, the tone of his voice when he told stories about the past. And she realized something that chilled her to the bone. He wasn't over her. But more than that, he wasn't even trying to be. It was all a performance. Not just hers, but his too. He had built a life that mirrored what he once had, adjusting the details just enough to convince himself it was new. But his heart remained tethered to the version of love that had once broken. He wasn't moving forward. He was looping, recreating, recasting. And she was the actress who had stepped onto the stage without reading the script. Her lines were borrowed. Her presence was convenient. Her essence was secondary. One night, while they lay in bed in the dark, his hand tracing circles on her back, he whispered something. It was soft, half asleep, the kind of confession that slips out when the mind forgets to filter. But it wasn't her name, he said. It was hers. The X clear. Unapologetic. Heavy as thunder. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. She kept her breathing steady, pretending sleep, her eyes wide open in the dark. Her body stiffened only slightly, enough for her own awareness, not enough for him to notice. He didn't. He drifted off moments later, content in a fantasy that didn't include her. She lay there for hours, unmoving. The ceiling above her blurred and focused and blurred again as tears came silently. She had imagined this moment before. Feared it. But the reality of it was so much colder than she'd expected. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was subtle and devastating and impossibly quiet. Like the final breath of something that had never really been alive to begin with. She didn't cry for him. She cried for herself. For the version of her that had tried so hard. For the girl who had believed love could be earned by effort. For the woman who had erased herself, piece by piece, just to fit into a mold that was never meant for her. The next morning, she got out of bed before him. Made coffee. Sat by the window. The city outside looked unchanged, unaware of the quiet disaster unfolding inside her chest. She stared at her reflection in the glass, trying to see herself. But all she could see was the ghost. The woman who had tried to become someone else's memory. The woman who now knew without doubt that she had failed. Not because she wasn't enough, but because she was never supposed to succeed. She went through the motions that day. Smiled when he spoke. Cooked dinner. Answered politely. But she was no longer present. Something inside her had folded inward, retreating from the performance. She didn't want to be seen. Not by him. Not by anyone. The idea of continuing this life, this quiet reenactment of someone else's love story, felt unbearable. But the idea of leaving felt equally impossible. Where would she go? Who was she now after so much reshaping? She thought about calling a friend, but the words wouldn't form. How do you explain that you've been pretending to be someone else in your own relationship? That you've worn someone else's scent, laughed someone else's laugh, and responded to a name that doesn't belong to you? That you've become a mirror held up to a man's grief, hoping that if you reflected it perfectly enough, he would eventually see you? That night, she didn't sleep. She lay beside him again, still, quiet, detached. She could hear his breathing, the calm rhythm of someone at peace. She envied it, hated it, loved it. It was all tangled now. Her pain and his comfort, her identity and his projection, her silence and his ignorance. They weren't in a relationship. They were in a ritual. And she was just a vessel. A beautiful, obedient echo of something he'd lost and wasn't ready to let go of. And now she wasn't sure she even wanted him to. Because the truth hurt. But letting go of the illusion, that might destroy her completely. She didn't plan the moment she left. There was no suitcase by the door, no silent goodbye scribbled on a folded napkin. It happened in stillness, in the kind of quiet that comes not with rage but with certainty. One morning she woke up before him, as she always did. The sun was slipping through the curtains in pale streaks, and the room smelled like lavender and old perfume, the one he'd asked her to wear. She sat up slowly, her body aching in ways she couldn't fully explain. Not from physical exhaustion, but from the weight of staying too long in a space she no longer fit into. She looked over at him, still asleep, breathing softly, his face peaceful in the way only someone unburdened by self-awareness could be. And in that moment, she understood with painful clarity that nothing she did would ever be enough to make him see her. She moved quietly, not because she feared waking him, but because she no longer wanted to disturb the illusion. Let him sleep. Let him keep the dream. She, on the other hand, had finally awoken. Her feet touched the cold floor, grounding her. She walked to the bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back was not a stranger anymore. She was a survivor. Tired, yes. Hollowed out in places, yes. But still standing. Still here. She ran her fingers over her skin, remembering the girl she used to be, the one who laughed loudly, who wore red lipstick unapologetically, who filled rooms with her presence instead of shrinking to fit someone else's expectations. She missed that version of herself. But maybe, just maybe, there was still time to bring her back. She didn't take much. A few clothes. Her journal. A single book she had once loved and stopped reading because he said it was too sad. She left the framed photo he'd insisted on keeping on their nightstand, the one of her smiling in a way that felt borrowed, her eyes reflecting a kind of sadness she'd taught herself to disguise. She left the perfume bottle on the dresser. Left the dress he loved on its hanger. Left the small, invisible pieces of herself scattered like breadcrumbs through the apartment. Let him keep the version of her he had crafted. She no longer needed it. Walking out wasn't triumphant. It wasn't a movie scene. Her hands trembled slightly as she closed the door behind her. Her heart beat too fast. Her throat felt tight. But there was a steadiness inside her now, something she hadn't felt in months. Maybe longer. She didn't look back. Not once. Outside, the city buzzed with life, cars honking, people laughing, the wind threading through her hair like it was welcoming her back. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, unsure of where to go, of who to call. But for once she didn't feel the urge to explain herself. She owed no one an explanation, least of all him. The first night alone was the hardest. Not because she missed him, but because the silence was so complete. No ghostly soundtrack playing softly from the other room. No phantom touches. No performance. Just her, sitting on a borrowed couch in a friend's spare apartment, wrapped in a blanket that didn't smell like him. She cried, but not from regret. The tears came like a release, not a wound. She cried for all the nights she had stayed silent. For all the times she had nodded and smiled when she wanted to scream. For the countless moments she had traded her authenticity for the comfort of someone else's memory. She began to rebuild slowly. Carefully. She bought a new journal and started writing again, not about him, but about herself. About the food she liked, the books she wanted to read, the places she dreamed of going. She cut her hair, short, wild, and uneven, and stared at her reflection until it felt like hers again. She threw away the clothes he had chosen for her. Bought a red scarf. Started wearing lipstick again, even if it smudged. Especially if it smudged. She called old friends, apologized where she needed to, laughed more often. The sound felt strange at first. Then real. Then right. It took weeks for her to stop flinching when she heard her old nickname. months to stop reaching for the perfume out of habit. But slowly the patterns broke. The loops unraveled. The silence in her new home became sacred. She filled it with her own music, her own stories, her own laughter. And one day she woke up and didn't think about him. Not even once. That was the day she knew she had finally come back to herself. He never reached out. Not to ask where she went. Not to say goodbye. Maybe he didn't notice she was gone. Maybe he had already started writing the next chapter with someone else. Maybe she had only ever been a transition between ghosts. The thought no longer made her ache. She didn't need closure. She didn't need revenge. She needed peace. And now she had it. She stood by her window one evening, holding a mug of tea, watching the city lights flicker like tiny stars. She wasn't healed completely. There were still scars, invisible ones that stung when touched. But she was whole in a way she hadn't been before. Honest. Awake. Unapologetically herself. And in that stillness, in that quiet, there was something beautiful. Something hers. Finally hers.